Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it is my 9-year anniversary of being on YouTube. Thank you all so much for sticking around this long. But now for the matter at hand, the project from last year you'll all want me to cover. From Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders, and the London Symphony Orchestra, Promises. This is one of those years where the voting came down to the wire, where it could have been one of three. The winner only got in by a single vote within the correct time frame. It was between Inside by Bo Burnham, which to be honest, I can't imagine that review going all that well, because that album works best with a visual component, and even then I've got a lot of messy and unpopular opinions about Bo Burnham and that special, or the breakthrough project of South Korean shoegaze artist Paranol. And I actually heard that album last year, and I purposefully chose not to cover it because the production just did not work for me whatsoever. And that leaves us with one of the most critically acclaimed projects of last year, an instrumental collaboration that in certain circles of experimental jazz and electronic music was widely being hailed as a late career landmark, including by some peers on this platform. Now there are two names to be aware of here, the first being Floating Points, a British electronic producer who has toured with the XX, worked with Hikaru Utada this past year, and has a small but critically acclaimed catalog this past decade. He's built up his classically trained reputation for impeccable textured dynamics, using a lot of analog instrumentation to interweave into electronic compositions, with a playful side that can still produce genuine beauty as he flits across various stripes and subgenres of electronica. But his resume kinda pales in comparison with Pharoah Sanders, a legendary saxophonist who's worked with figures spanning John Nels Coltrane, Leon Bridges, and a lot of the greats of avant-garde free jazz. Now I will freely admit right now that I don't have the greatest depth when it comes to Sanders' catalog. The man is over 80, he's already a legend, with a frankly stacked run of albums in the late 60s and early 70s that I really should make the time to properly explore, but that's a blemish on my record, not his, and how much I really need to do the proper deep dive with modern jazz. I cover the genre rarely, often not well, I often feel out of my depth, and while the project's actually shorter than you would expect, it was the sort of album in which I wanted to give this proper attention. If anything, albums like this highlight, despite 9 years of making videos, just how much more I have to learn and grow as a critic. But if you're more familiar with jazz, you're looking for the expert analysis, look, you're probably more equipped for it than I am, full disclosure there. But with all that in mind, what did I think of Promises? Well, I don't want to say this isn't good, or that it didn't deliver exactly what the collaborators wanted and what many critics describe with breathless enthusiasm. It's a marvelous piece that's excellently produced, melodically rich, impeccably balanced, but still showcasing organic texture to have a lot of real humanity, and as many have highlighted, delivers a moment of utterly ethereal beauty in the final third that's kind of worth listening to the entire project just to take it in. But I also feel it's one of those projects I can admire and respect more than I outright love it. There's certainly a lot of charm to the piece, I understand how I'm supposed to feel, but it also feels like I'm missing part of the impact, some of which comes through some structural critiques I have with the project, but also probably my lack of knowledge of Pharoah Sanders' broader catalog that feels like it's a culmination to this. It's like watching a clip of a climax point of a great movie that can stand alone, but minus the narrative that is built up to it, the emotional resonance might not be as potent. So okay, let's talk about the components of this piece, which begins with a 7-note melody that sounds like it's being played on a harpsichord interweaving with a tinkling piano. That musical motif, it's creaking and frail. You can hear the textured movement of the wood of the keyboard as the orchestra will begin to well up around it, and then Pharoah Sanders starts a-blowing, and the saxophone bounds across that foundation. And it's hard not to feel aware of how tactile and fragile it all feels. The saxophone might shine through, the arranged strings might create some of that foundation, but the delicacy of the increasingly fractured, cyclical keyboard motif that holds the bottom of it all, everything added has to be balanced off of that. Be they gentle processed tones that almost feel spacey and psychedelic across movement 3, amidst some starry keys, to all the mouth mouth noises that are closer to scat on movement 4. It showcases a balance where if things get too fanciful or grand, there's this playfully human juxtaposition, showcasing the improvisational push and pull you often get from the great free jazz, where part of the magic is how virtuoso playing will just careen off of whatever structure you might have. Where around movement 5, the mix builds more swell and layers with a counter melody in the keys and the synths off the main motif, and Pharoah Sanders' fluttering saxophone all the way. But then we get the last 4 movements of the album, where the aching strings will rise more to the forefront across a larger, slower crescendo, so yearning and sincere in their sense of grandeur that you find yourself yearning for Sanders' saxophone to break that rising tension. And yet it only returns when the mix is calmed to a far more spare and intimate place on movement 7, where you can feel every shuddering breath behind those notes, and more distant, burbling, futuristic flutters that gradually pick up more bass frequencies and cascading chaotic swell. It's damn near magical, it's effervescent, it's transcendent. And then it ebbs away again, with fragmented keys and abortive organ feeling like the half-heard transmissions from a signal in the vast open night, which leads to a false ending on movement 8 where you're left thinking that it's all gonna hang unresolved. But if you listen very closely, you can hear the faint breath, muffled taps, someone's still moving around the room. And it leads to a final coda where, minus that underlying foundational harpsichord line for the strings, it keens out one final time, and then it all goes away. So let's get into some of those structural critiques. Because there's really not a lot to say about the frankly gorgeous production and interplay. There's no lyrics here either. And I think I have to start with that central 7-note melody that repeats throughout nearly the entire piece. Don't get me wrong, I like how it shakes and layers and decomposes and feels ever so slightly askew, but in terms of the actual tune, it feels like a question constantly prodding for an answer that we never really get. Now, for an album titled Promises, kind of makes sense. It's a leap of faith. It's trust that something will resolve, the payoff will come, and yet I'm not quite sure that really does, at least in the place where it makes the most sense. This is where it comes to the movements themselves, and while it would make sense to see this as one continuous piece, you really can't split out between a best and worst tracks, the segments and splitting of the movements can feel a bit odd, with the first 5 movements accounting for about 19 minutes and the last 4 for about 28 minutes. And again, it makes sense in giving the strings crescendo plenty of room to breathe, but I can leave Pharoah Sanders' greater presence in the first 5 movements feeling slightly lacking in balance. It left me wondering why Sanders' saxophone was not more of a counterweight for the back half of the album outside of movement 7, where it really could have been useful in contrast to all the spacey synths and the strings. And the fact that he's a far smaller presence on the final 2 movements, at least to me, feels like a misstep, where it becomes more about interplay between floating points and the orchestra directly. And you know what, that could have worked too. Sanders' improvisational style feels like an influence compositionally on the organ runs in movement 8, for instance. But that main melodic motif is a question that's always being posed, a trust that's being extended. With Sanders' saxophone as a response internally, he should have been involved in resolving some of that tension. This is where we also get to the false ending before the coda. I mean, it feels intentional to draw attention to the human beings and the connection at the very core. It was a really solid use of negative space. And yet when the strings come back for the coda, the ending there feels just as abortive, if not more so, leaving more questions than answers, especially after such a startlingly beautiful culmination in movement 7 that could have easily closed off the piece. But maybe that's the point. An extended, open-ended challenge with its final promise, where if there was a payoff that earned you your faith, refocus the lens to highlight the humanity of that promise, and then places the final promise in your hands as it abruptly disappears off into space, goes back to its home planet. And it might feel amorphous, a little fragmented, where you're not quite seeing all the picture as it comes together. But hey, that's the reality of what trust is, with abstract art often demanding a deeper promise in sincerely engaging with it, because it'll only give back what we choose to have delivered in the conversation. But I feel like there's a difference between the promise made to the audience that's implicit and those made internally within the work, and that's where Promises feels a bit lopsided to me, where intentionally leaving odd gaps doesn't always accentuate what can make the best moments of this piece so moving. But then again, this is jazz. It's not enough to pay attention to the notes, but also to where the notes are not being played. And if there's an album that knows how to create magic out of those intangible spaces, I think it's this one. Even if tonally it leaves you yearning for the promise that could be fulfilled. And I guess you understand why I'm kind of conflicted with it. Most of which I've cited here as structural frustrations on my part. They're not just intentional, they're thematically important. They will strike as resonance to those who were able to buy in. And I genuinely want to buy into this album. Floating Points is such a wonderful command of analog textures. I love how well this album commands its dynamics, flows so effortlessly. The strings from the London Symphony Orchestra are just heartbreaking, and Pharoah Sanders' playfully chaotic sensibilities are the perfect counterweight to the arranged classical pomp. But sometimes you can fulfill every word of a promise to the letter. You can buy in, be left hanging, and yet it's all going to feel worth it. And I'm just not sure I'm all the way there. Again, I get how an album like this is supposed to make me feel, and it's so nearly there. But I feel like I'm the one missing that piece to make it all properly click together. Maybe it'll come with more time. Still, it's damn impressive. Absolutely not for everyone, as you would expect for experimental blends of classical music, electronic music, and free jazz. But for those of you who are curious, I don't know, might be a promise worth keeping. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Yeah, 9 long years. This is where I would normally go off on some sort of extended diatribe of where I'm at and where things are going to be going for the future. I honestly don't feel the need to as much right now. The album is great, and again, I think there's a lot here that I wish was pushing it more towards the transcendence that a lot of people do. Maybe that'll come with time to doing the proper dive with Pharoah Sanders' catalog, which I do genuinely want to do. I just have no time. Have you seen my back catalog? It's kind of ridiculous. Beyond that, though, again, I want to thank you all for sticking around this long. 9 years, and the past 6 months has seen a lot of transition and changes within the channel, most of which I've actually seen some decent fruit that I want to keep on pushing towards, especially with the short reviews and then aggregating them together. It's letting me get through my backlog a little bit more systematically, and I do appreciate that. But hey, if you all have comments, please leave them down there below. I'm happy to see any of you who have actually stuck around. It really does mean a lot, especially as, again, we're the channel of this size, especially with a lot of niche content. It's nice when people are still watching. But beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in helping maybe support the channel so we keep on going for another 9 years, link to my Patreon is right over there, where you can get albums on my schedule, you can just help support the channel, or hell, even argue with me directly on Discord. That's a lot of fun. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.